All right, hello everybody. Welcome to Frontiers in the Environment. My name is Todd Rubold. I'm the Communications Director here at the Institute of the Environment. If you haven't been to Frontiers before, we have a handy hashtag up on the board if you want to tweet about today's session. Really looking forward to today's conversation. When it gets to the Q&A, wait for me, I'll come around with the microphone. And also want to welcome those of you watching online from Duluth and elsewhere around the country. So we have a really great topic today. We're going to be talking about where does climate justice fit in the climate adaptation puzzle. And our speakers for today are Jack DeWaard. Jack is an assistant professor of sociology in the College of Liberal Arts, and he's also with the graduate faculty at the Minnesota Population Center. And with us here today from IONE is Beth Mercer-Taylor. She's the coordinator of sustainability studies at the university. And I want to welcome them all to Frontiers in the Environment. Welcome you all too. Thank you.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Trying out my microphone here. Okay, so my name is Jack DeWaard, and I'll do a brief introduction here in a bit since this is my first talk at IONE. So thank you to IONE and to Beth for the invitation to do this. Let me clarify my role here for the next 20 minutes. What I want to do is I want to set up this link between climate change adaptation and justice. And I am a scholar of human migration. So I'm going to take you on a wild ride thinking about this as a migration scholar, right? Because we can think of migration as one form of adaptation. So as Todd mentioned, I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology and at the Minnesota Population Center, where I also serve on the advisory board. I do work on human migration patterns, including population displacement, population distribution, and redistribution. So, more concretely, what does that mean? It means that I study things like the drivers of migration. So this is a nice diagram that Richard Black and his group put together. What's interesting about this is actually a number of things, but to me, it's that in the past decade or so, there's been a very big push to start incorporating features of the natural environment into what I think of as sort of canonical accounts of why people move, why people migrate. So those canonical accounts are coming out of economics. There's some very influential work there, political science, sociology, and demography primarily. Okay? So there's been this push to incorporate these other drivers of migration. I also do a lot of work on migration flows and on age patterns of migration. So the graph on the left is a diagram of international migration flows. You may have saw this. This is by one of my colleagues and co-authors, Guy Abel, published in Science a couple of years ago. What's interesting about this, again, a lot of things. What do I notice? I notice that places are connected in very unique ways. You don't see sort of a random movement across the screen here from origins and destinations. And you also see that certain places are not connected, right? And we can ask a lot of questions about the historical reasons why we have these connections. And we can actually use them to make projections and predictions going forward. Sometimes we refer to these sorts of diagrams as telling us something about migration systems. In policy circles, we tend to use words like pathways and corridors, like the International Organization for Migration does. On the right, you can see what's called a model migration schedule. This is sort of a stylized version of an age pattern of migration. What does this tell us? It tells us that migration is very much a life course process. So in addition to my other affiliations, I'm also a faculty affiliate at the Life Course Center at the University of Minnesota. Underlying both of these diagrams, right, are data. And so I lose sleep at night thinking about the availability, thinking about the quality and the comparability, especially the cross-national comparability of migration data. Compared to other demographic processes, especially mortality and fertility, the migration data that we use are notoriously poor. And so there's always this additional set of steps we have to do to talk about our data and maybe some adjustments that we put together to make things work. What else do? I try and assemble this information so that it talks about topics that people care about, topics that are relevant. So most recently, what I did is I looked at demographic patterns of migration to and within European countries and used that to create a link to issues of assimilation and integration, focusing on the bottom right there on anti-foreigner or anti-immigrant sentiment among native-born respondents in European countries. So I try and sort of get at what I call the 3 C's, the causes, the characteristics, and the consequences of migration. But that's not really what I'm here to do today, right? Today what I'm trying to do is to convince you, and I don't think it'll take much convincing, that migration is one type, one form of adaptation in the face of climate change. And so in thinking about this and how to approach this today, I thought that perhaps one useful place to start would be with the classic IPCC specification, where we're thinking about vulnerability as a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. I'm hoping everybody in the room is familiar with that. So about 2 years ago, one of my colleagues, Robert McClellan, published this book, Climate and Human Migration, right? And it was an attempt to draw attention to the idea of migration within a context of climate vulnerability. Okay? Migration within a context of climate vulnerability also involves those first two components, exposure and sensitivity, and I'll define these in just a little bit, as well as adaptation options other than migration. Okay? So what I want to do is I want to walk through these components, but I'm going to spend the largest chunk of time on sensitivity, because that's where I'm going to draw the connection to equity, or what we're calling justice today. So very briefly, what do we mean by exposure? We mean exposure to a climate stimulus. Okay? So we can make a number of cuts, and there are a number of cuts in the literature. We can distinguish between rapid onset and slow onset events and processes. We can talk about their duration, and we can talk about their frequency. Okay? I have a report that I can share with you later at the end of the talk if you're interested in some research in this particular area. But I want to focus on sensitivity. Okay? So I'm talking about the sensitivity of populations and places to a given climate stimulus. The sensitivity of populations and places to a given climate stimulus. How do we think about this, and how have migration scholars thought about this? I want to walk you through one point of entry, and there are many points of entry. Migration scholars are quick to acknowledge that migration is a highly selective process. Okay? It's not just a random assortment of people who decide to migrate. It's certain people and not others. So let's think about this hypothetical example that I have on the screen in front of you. I want you to imagine that we're looking at a population in a home country or a home area. We might also call this the sending area or potential sending area. That's the distribution to the left there. We're going to organize this distribution according to a characteristic or a set of characteristics that we care about. So in this case, we're going to be looking at economic returns for a given level of skill. Okay? Economic returns for a given level of skill. Now that outcome could be a wage. Here, the example I pulled is using income. Okay? So this is the income you're commanding from a given level of skill. So for any person in this distribution, you're going to take stock of what income you can get for your skill level, and you're going to look over at the destination area, and you're going to say, if I can improve my lot, then the rational thing to do is to migrate. Okay? And you can see here that everybody in that initial distribution on the left is going to migrate because they're going to increase their income given their skill level. Okay? This is a stylized demonstration, obviously. Okay? But this is where we get those words like the wage gap, the income gap, the employment gap. This is where that comes from. This is sort of a neoclassical economic rendering. Okay, we can go a little bit further now, and it's not too difficult to imagine that we can play around with the shapes of each of those distributions. We can also imagine that those distributions intersect a little bit differently, right, in different contexts. And what this tells us is that instead of getting everybody to migrate, perhaps we're going to get people from the tails of these distributions. So on the left, we have an example of the less skilled individuals moving, but not those who are more skilled. On the right, we have a situation where those who are highly skilled would migrate, but not those who are less skilled. And lest I clutter up the slide here, we could imagine a situation where we're getting individuals from both sides of the distribution, but not in the middle, right? And this is very much the situation of the United States today. Immigrants are very negatively selected and very positively selected. And this development stems back to the 1965 Immigration Act, right, where we shifted attention away from prioritizing immigrants from Europe and prioritizing family reunification, which is an implicit acknowledgement that the origin regions, origin countries had changed, primarily to Asia and in Latin America. Okay, we can learn a lot about migration by thinking about processes of selection. And one way to sort of sum this up is that we can learn a lot about who migrates, we can learn a lot about the volume of migration by thinking about variation, both within and between populations and places, right? Looking at those distributions on the previous slide within and between populations and places. Social scientists like Stephen Castles and colleagues, this is sort of a foundational text that even I assigned in my graduate course, The Age of Migration, now in its 5th edition, call this variation inequality. The suggestion then is that migration is driven by, is a response to inequality. Okay? That's the first sort of step we want to take. We've gone from adaptation to thinking about migration to thinking about inequality. And the question now is why we care in the context of our talk today. Okay, at any part in that distribution that I showed you before, there's a level of risk and a level of resources that accompany that position when we're thinking about responding to climate change. Okay? There is a level of risk and a level of resources that accompany that position. Those, for instance, at the far left side of that distribution, the arrow in red up there, those at the far left side of that distribution are perhaps the most vulnerable to climate change. They also have the least amount of resources to improve their situation, to respond to their situation, to migrate as one adaptive strategy. Okay. What happens then? They cannot migrate. They don't have the resources to do so, even if it would be in their best interest, even if it would be the rational thing to do according to sort of a neoclassical economic view. They are stuck. They're trapped. So Richard Black, and not just Richard Black, but a number of other people refer to these groups as trapped populations. Right? We call these poverty traps sometimes. Groups that are too poor to move, even if it is in their best interest to do so. Okay, now you're probably getting tired of stylized examples, so let's find some empirical data and get an estimate of these poverty traps. This is one of my favorite papers. This was published in 2004, a really innovative data set by Andrienko and Guryov. It's looking at internal migration within Russia at the level of Russian regions. Now, this is not a paper about climate change. This is a paper about the economic drivers and determinants of migration. They come up with an estimate of poverty traps, and we can think of this as sort of a baseline estimate that could get exacerbated in the context of climate change, in a context of vulnerability. And they suggest that about 1/3 of Russian regions are locked in these poverty traps. 1/3 of Russian regions. That's a pretty large number. Okay. These people are too poor to migrate in these regions. Now, there's a couple of things we want to realize here. Number one, it costs something to migrate. The literature is clear that there is certainly a psychological cost associated with migrating, being away from family and friends, striking out on your own, potentially failing in the process. Okay? There is also an economic or a monetary cost when it comes to migration. Right? It costs something to up and move. We can talk about this in sort of an innocuous way and say these are the costs of moving, but we can think about the cost of hiring a coyote to cross the Mexico-US border. Costs which have multiplied quite a bit with the increase in the border enforcement budget on the US side. The second thing that we want to realize here, where do we start to think about intervention? Okay? Where do we start to think about intervention? And I'm going to pose that question now, and I'm not going to answer it until the end of the talk. Okay? But as we start thinking about this idea of justice, this idea of equity that we raised earlier, we have to keep in mind that at each part of the distribution, the needs of individuals or of families or of households are very, very different. Right? The needs are very, very different. So we need to push beyond a situation where we're calling for equality, which we might liken to something like equal opportunity, and push toward a situation, push toward a call towards equity, push toward a call towards justice. The third thing I want to think about today is adaptation options other than migration. Okay. So what I've suggested is with this idea that migration is tied to inequality and inequality is tied to resources, that people are stuck in place. It's not as if only the poor migrate, because some of the poor are too poor to do anything about their situation. Okay? And we have evidence for these poverty traps. But beyond this, there's also a pretty hefty literature on the migration side that most people prefer not to move. Okay? So most recently, Alan Finlay published a paper, and he includes several general principles to guide research on environmental migration. The very first principle is people don't want to go. This is actually an idea that goes all the way back to a very foundational paper in migration studies, The Laws of Migration by E.G. Revenstein. So whether we're talking about poverty traps or whether we're talking about the fact that most people don't want to move, this sets up a very important question for migration scholars for me. In order to tell a story about migration as one type of adaptation strategy, I also need to be thinking about the other ways that people would adapt in place. It's not as if adaptation options are lined up on a shelf and people can just pick which ones they want. Migration is something that temporally seems to come last as an option of last resort. So recently, a colleague and I set out to look at this idea a little bit more formally. And what we said is, okay, given that migration can be an option of last resort, we can think of two ways in which the timing of migration could unfold. On the x-axis here, we have the time after a given climate signal from t to t plus n. On the y-axis, we have the risk of migration, right? I'm going to define that generically for now, ranging from low to high. The first scenario actually borrows from McClemens' work. He was the author of the book I cited earlier. Borrows from his work on settlement abandonment, right? And it's exactly how it sounds. Migration to the point where settlements are abandoned. Here's the logic. People are trying to adapt in situ. They are cycling through the options that are available to them. What would those options be? Well, in the case that we looked at here, which I'll explain in just a little bit, we run through a number of them. It could be agricultural intensification. It could be agricultural diversification. It could be drawing down financial reserves. It could be public assistance. It could be moving in with mom or dad or extended family members. Any number of options. Okay? Families, households, individuals cycle through these resources and gradually begin to exhaust them so that the risk of migration begins to rise. We also know that migration is a social process as well. So as this risk is rising, as I'm watching each one of you try your lot and move on, I am pulled to follow you. Right? I'm inclined to follow you. And we think about these as sort of migration networks, and there's a lot of research that focus on this. Now here's a couple problems with this model. Number one, I just talked about the fact that people are locked in poverty traps. They cannot move. Number two, I just suggested that most people don't want to move. So internationally, at least, less than 3% of the global population have ever migrated. And in a given 5-year period, the most current estimates suggest that the proportion of people migrating is less than 0.5%. Very, very few people migrate. Most people want to stick around. And then finally, despite the literature on settlement abandonment, it's actually a relatively rare phenomenon. So in McClemens' case, he's actually put this model together really to explain a specific case, which was Dust Bowl migration out of Oklahoma. So what my colleague and I do is we say, okay, we can understand that people would be cycling through these resources. But we can think of two other dynamics that would cause the risk of migration then to decline. The first is sort of a process of learning, a process of trial and error, right? People are trying on strategies and things eventually begin to stick. They become more proficient at navigating strategies and implementing them. The second is a compositional story. Suppose that those individuals who are the most likely to migrate because they have the resources to do so, the will to do so, they leave. Compositionally, that's going to leave a population that's less likely to do so. So at the same time I'm saying that folks can eventually adapt in place, we have to keep in mind that these dynamics could actually exacerbate inequality. What do we find? We looked at a case of Mexico-US migration. We controlled for a whole variety of things. I'm happy to point you to the paper. The x-axis is lag time. So we're thinking about 1 year, 2 year, 3, all the way up to 7 years after a given climate signal. The y-axis is an odds ratio, and we're thinking about we're thinking about the odds of Mexico-US migration over the period 1980s to 1990s. And these are multi-level survival models. Okay? These are the odds for a standard deviation in the warm spell duration index. And we measured this using the expert team on climate change detection and indices, the ETCCDI. We also had a similar model where we brought in precipitation measures as well. We have similar results for that. What do we find? The odds, other than that last year, are consistently above 1. They increase at year 3, and then they decrease at year 4, consistent with that second pattern I showed you before. Okay? Our data do not allow us in this case to actually identify a specific mechanism involved, but there are at least two working, right? That compositional story or that trial and error story. So where does this leave us, and really where does this leave Beth for the next step here? So what I tried to do is to connect migration to inequality early on and inequality to risk and resources. Okay? I had the opportunity to attend COP21 earlier this year. This is a photo from sort of a back-to-back panel for the International Organization for Migration. Here are some of the things that they talked about, and if you want to talk to me later, I can tell you about a lot of things they didn't talk about. Number one, when we're starting to think about interventions, this word targeted interventions, identifying the most vulnerable places and populations, right? Moving toward equity, not just equality. Number two, because people are trapped, or because they don't want to move, or because settlement abandonment is a relatively rare phenomenon, intervening on the home or the sending side of the equation, as opposed to the destination or the receiving side. Finally, intervening early on, right? As people are beginning to cycle through the strategies available to them, What does this mean? It means assistance with navigation, right? What exists and what is the knowledge of the resources that are out there? The second is implementation. For a given resource that exists, is it accessible and what is the quality? So if we're talking about the ability to go secure a loan or a line of credit as a bank, is that bank stable? Does that bank nearby? These sorts of things. Okay. And then finally, and I think Beth is going to talk about this more, this word reparations. Right? I was very glad in the Paris Agreement to see the words migrants and to see the word displacement show up. Okay? But I think as we're really talking about justice, the idea that people are different in that distribution I showed you before in terms of their risk and their resources, I do think we need to take this word reparations a little bit further in our discussions. So with that, thank you.
All right, is the mic on? And I want to start by giving you a preview answer to the question raised, which is where does justice fit in the climate adaptation puzzle? And I first started thinking it's maybe a piece at the center. And then I realized, actually, it's the table that the puzzle's on. So that's where I come from. And I want to share that the inspiration for talking to you today about climate and justice really comes from the Black Lives Matter movement. I didn't know they would be at Paris. I was also at the COP21 talks. But they were, and they had a formal side event, and then they also had a rally. And it was very moving. They had a die-in first, so you can see a person in the die-in in the photo there in the right, lying down, and then kind of came together holding signs. And on the left is Dr. Robert Bullard, who is considered the father of environmental justice. Not pictured, but actually right there, just near me where I was taking the photo, is Dr. Rose Brewer, who's a professor here at the university in African and African-American studies and has been a leader in environmental justice both in the state and nationally. And I can answer a lot more questions about the amazing work she's done, but she had a conference in 2011 called Black Environmental Thought that was really one of the most amazing professional experiences I've had. So when I went to Paris and saw this movement and heard the connections between the slow violence of climate change and the fast violence of police brutality, I thought I want to share that back at home. And I am glad that actually I think we're complicating in this very session the idea of slow and fast violence, because when you look at adaptation, the violence of climate change, if you think of the need to migrate and become a refugee as violence, is really not so fast. I'm going to talk about 3 different international entities, and then I am going to kind of bring things home quickly to Minnesota. Our time is short and we want to have questions. So the first one I'm going to talk about is called civilsocietyReview.org. And they did a report called Fair Shares, a Civil Society Equity Review of INDCs. Welcome to the alphabet soup of the United Nations. That stands for Intended Nationally Determined Contributions. It's really pledges from countries around the world. 196 of them made these pledges. And I think if you go hear Jessica Hellman talk about her experience in Paris, you'll hear that those pledges collected are not adequate to our need for greater ambition. I think right now, the science community agrees that if all those pledges were actually enacted fully, we would still have a 3.7 degree Celsius temperature increase, and we need 1.5 to stay alive. And that's kind of a theme in this Fair Shares analysis, but what you really see is a country-by-country look at, are you doing well enough, and are you doing what you're doing in a fair way? You might be wondering who's behind this, and here's a slide just showing you some of the big NGOs. Locally here, you might know the World Wildlife Federation or the PANDA, or you might know 350. You might know Oxfam. A lot of the other logos there are from Global South related NGOs, and some of you who work more with people and justice issues might be familiar with them, and it's all online as well. They really highlight in this report, and it's actually threaded throughout the Paris Agreement, this idea of equity and fair share in thinking about responding to climate change, both mitigation and adaptation. So the idea of equity and fair shares basically means, the way it has played out, all countries have some responsibility. All countries are contributing to climate change. But some countries have a much higher capacity to take action. They have financial resources. They have technology resources. And furthermore, some countries have already emitted a great deal more historically. So under the idea of like polluter pays, they have more responsibility. In the UN jargon world, that becomes common but differentiated responsibility, or CBDR. And you can kind of see a big blobby part there on the left in the map, and that's the US, which has emitted a lot more historically. And this is a map that shows countries based on the size of their emissions. And it's in that report. You can check it out. There were a lot of people worried that this common but differentiated responsibility wouldn't make it into the Paris Agreement, but it did. It's in Article 2.2. A lot of folks also think it's not kind of well enough integrated, but it is there. So you might be wondering, hey, what's the USA doing? Is it meeting its fair share around responding? And actually, you know, the Fair Shares Review and many other commentators would say no. What I found interesting looking at this report is not only no, are we not meeting the obligation that we have historically and in thinking about equity, we actually also, even with the most ambitious domestic actions we could take, if everybody in all of the states became climate leaders like Minnesota and we all embrace the Clean Power Plan, we can't do it in our own borders, in our own national borders. Our fair share is too large for us to do that just here at home. And so that's why you see that blue marble image in the background, because we really need to be global citizens when we think about climate adaptation and climate mitigation. We need to enable developing countries, us as developed country folks, to take on action. And we need to do it using a cooperative approach. And there's a lot more you could say about that. But really that means a massively scaled up international public finance effort. And that would include both emissions reduction, but also adaptation for the justice issues, the loss and damage, the reparations, here and now. And that's tricky. The next group I want to talk about is the People's Test on Climate. And it's actually more of a collaborative effort. Again, a lot of the same NGOs I just showed you were involved with it. And they come up with 4 key points to think about. Is a climate agreement really meeting a fair share or a justice test? And it has 4 points. The first one, it's probably really familiar to this audience, is basically like, are you getting the science right? Are you catalyzing immediate, urgent, drastic emissions reductions? So this is more on the mitigation side. And there's that classic graph that shows the increases in CO2. This one is from NASA, so it goes way back in time and shows you that, yes, indeed, CO2 has had cycles in the past, but there we are on the far right today, and we have a problem. And you know, are we addressing that problem and keeping that science front and center? Are we actually taking action that will result in a 1.5 to stay alive instead of 3.7 or some other higher temperature increase that's really unworkable? Okay, number 2, provide adequate support for transformation. And this circles back to finance and technology transfer. So from developed countries like us, the US, other European countries, to developing countries. Most especially in vulnerable and in poor countries, this is urgent. And again, if we're going to meet our fair share, we have to do this. This is a slide. At the bottom of the slide, you see some of the logos from some of the green climate and climate finance mechanisms and funds that are already deeply engaged in this work. It was really apparent at Paris how much ahead of us in some ways the European entities are in just integrating this into the norms of their business community. But that said, there's still a big finance gap even from Europe. So at Paris, there's a $100 billion commitment, but really the commitment even year by year needs to be more like $1 trillion. I'm not an expert at the nuances of that, but big, big gap. Third, deliver justice for impacted people. And this is this reparations, or in the UN jargon, the word loss and damage, or the phrase loss and damage is often used. So there will be people, like in this photo, this is between Iraq and Syria during a rainstorm event in 2008 at a refugee camp. 2008, it's probably worse now. There are situations that are going to be beyond ability to adapt. And the other thing that photo kind of captures is that second commitment, which is not just enough to kind of move people. They actually also need to have a livelihood. Just move people to a refugee camp and then their work is facing flooding. I mean, this isn't this isn't really a just and sustainable future. And finally, the fourth point for that people's test on climate is a focus on transformative action. And in this room, I would tell you that this is probably the most controversial of these 4 points. So they say ensure renewable and efficient solutions are emphasized, and you might think that sounds great, but actually they also really, at least the People's Test on Climate group, doesn't really care for any kind of financing of industry. So fossil fuel-based industry financed in a clean finance mechanism, they are not fans of that. So you can see in my little photos in the slide why coal projects in the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM, undermine climate goals. That would be a unsustainable, false solution, according to the People's Climate Test organizers. And then there's a industry, that's clean pollution, maybe not. And I know, having worked, some of you might have worked with Elizabeth Wilson, who I think sees the promise of carbon sequestration at a large scale in China, probably not delivering. She might have more up-to-date information on that, but certainly there's issues to be concerned with. The other organization I want to buzz through here quickly is more acronyms for you. The United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, or UNHCR. That's a branch of the UN that's been responding to what Jack works on every day, issues of people moving and being displaced, and very urgent situations. They've done that for decades. They're, I think, well respected. Only in the last few years have they really looked at environment and climate change in a serious way. So that got my attention in Paris. So they, in their report, which you can get if you go to unhcr.org, it's like right there at the front, they talk about the massive protection challenges raised by climate-related displacement. It's kind of their most urgent issue when you look through their webpage. And there's a lot of urgent issues. Think about Syria, think about other parts of the world that you might think somebody working every day on refugees would be looking at, but they look at climate change as the biggest one on their horizon. I also learned that they partner with a group, and Jack may know more about this, called the Advisory Group on Climate Change and Human Mobility. And one of the things that came out of this group is something called the Nansen Initiative, and that handles cross-border displacement from environment or climate-related hazards. And I didn't realize, but maybe some of you already know, there's a convention on refugees, a 1951 convention that's been accepted by the UN, that basically allows people to have refugee status on certain grounds, a well-founded fear of persecution, and then they have to kind of fall into several different groups. But none of those groups is about needing to flee due to an environmental hazard or due to climate change. So this Nansen Initiative is very aware of that as a problem in the way that we work across countries and with international bodies. So the other thing that the UNHCR really emphasizes throughout their report is that this protection needs our political attention, and it needs our focus, it needs our funding, but it also needs to work operationally. They say not just conceptually, but operationally, which really means, so you see here a photo in the background that illustrates that. Those are Somali refugees fleeing a flood in Dadaab, Kenya. So they were moved to Dadaab, Kenya, but that's a place that has a lot of both drought and flooding. So they were moved, but maybe operationally a move isn't really working. So kind of maybe a systems approach is needed. This is a graphic that I thought was interesting, a difficult one. Sorry to throw this to you with not much time to look at it, but on the left, you can see the number of millions of people displaced per year. And then at the bottom, the time scale goes from 1970 to about 2013. And based on the different colors reflect displacement events based on different sizes of population displacement. So in light blue at the very bottom is displacement events of 100,000 people or less, and then in yellow is 1 million people or less, black is 3 million people or less, and then greater than 3 million is red. And overall, you can see that a lot of people have been displaced in recent years. Since 2008, this Internal Displacement Monitoring Center says an average of 26.4 million people per year have been displaced. And there's a upward trajectory in the large displacement events in that red line. So I want to bring it home now from international entities that are working on climate adaptation justice to Minneapolis, working on climate adaptation and a bit of justice. So I have a highlight of a report that I can share with you if you're interested. That's up on the City of Minneapolis' Sustainability Office webpage. And this actually might be familiar to some of you if you know Carissa Shively-Slaughterback, because it was a report that her capstone class worked on really looking in detail at climate change impacts, adaptation strategies for the City of Minneapolis. And they're in 4 categories, so you can see them: public health, natural environment, stormwater management, and utilities. And really the one that intersects with the justice issue the most is public health. And that's because of heat-related events and how that connects to respiratory illness, disease spread by insects, or waterborne diseases. And there's disproportionate impacts on vulnerable people. I had hoped we might be able to have at this panel Kristen Rabb, and I hope we'll be able to bring her into Frontiers later, because she's a person doing a lot of great work on adaptation here in Minnesota. She's the climate change coordinator for the Minnesota Department of Health, and she sits on a variety of national and international bodies that are looking at how the public health profession is thinking about responding and adapting to climate change. So the couple, the image there of average annual all-season temperature change is for Minnesota. So we do have an issue of temperature increase here, and there is an impact on public health. There's a correlation between the temperature increases and emergency room visits, and there's really not enough data for Kristen and her colleagues to have a lot of conclusions about that yet. They'd like to see more data. As I was looking up Kristen's information, I discovered that she's running a forum next summer. So those of you who actually work in adaptation, check that out and probably connect with her. It looks like she's one of the leaders of it. So, and with that, Jack and I both welcome your questions. I think he might be like me and having a whole stack of brochures sitting back in his office on any topic related to adaptation, climate, Paris that you might be interested in. Thanks.
So I'll come around with the microphone if you do have questions, and I should mention that INE is also playing a major role in the adaptation forum that was just mentioned by Beth, that was just announced, so it's kind of breaking news. You'll hear more about as the year goes on. So questions?
I didn't know that. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question, and I'm gonna apologize a little. It may be a tricky question, but as people that are setting the agenda in this kind of climate change, adaptation strategy, and equity, how do you think we can do better institutionally ourselves? Like if we look in this room, we're mostly probably white people that are upper middle class, and I just went to this really awesome thing yesterday that was the Elvin Alley Dance Company, and they did this awesome Exodus routine, which was this story about climate change and justice, pretty much. And so I have been thinking a lot about this comment Trump made about, well, I don't know what we mean by white supremacist, and I'm just thinking, like, we kind of are white supremacist here in this institution, and how could we do better to not just learn about, but learn from people?
I'll take a crack at that, because that question gives me a chance to highlight Kate Flick, who just asked the question, and Chris Baumler, who's sitting over there, because I think one of the ways of expanding the conversation and even the frame in terms of a conversation about climate and justice is to think about leading not with policymakers like myself or researchers, but maybe with people who are working in a creative capacity where they're using a different language from the beginning. And that's an idea that's kind of unfolding right now, because Chris and Rebecca, who's right there too, are teaching a class that's our art and ecology class, and Nick Jordan is co-teaching with them, where they're having students sort of come into that conversation between those disciplines. I think there's a whole lot of other things that we can do, including working more closely with our campus climate initiative here on campus, and really thinking about the frame and invitation into the urgent work that I strongly believe is for everyone. And I'll tell you all in the audience, I have actually no environmental science background. I come from law and public policy, and I love art, but I think this work is for everyone.
So the folks like the European Commission have taken a position that immigration policy and integration policy go hand in hand, right? So it's sort of a two-way street here. And so anytime we're thinking about immigration and integration policy, we can't help but think about issues of nationality, ethnicity, and race. And so I really appreciated, when Beth was putting together her slides, the first slides is Black Lives Matter, in part because, it's sort of whitewashing, sort of literally, to talk about migration without talking about race, right? When I talked about the fact that we have selection from both sides of the distribution, for instance, there are some very sort of staunch realities that we need to acknowledge with respect to what you could call race relations, but what social scientists now call sort of racial domination within the United States and worldwide. So I think that part of it is taking a nice, long, honest look at ourselves, especially when we're in the context of migration and climate-driven migration.
I'll ask a quick question while I walk to the front of the audience, something I'm really curious about. So we've heard about climate migration in places like Bangladesh, Pacific Islands. Been a lot of research and stories lately about the role that climate played in the Syrian refugee crisis. Where are the places in the world right now that experts are looking for that potential next environmental migration?
So the short answer is that if I had a good friend of mine, Lori Hunter, is at the University of Colorado Boulder here, she would say that part of the reason we need to have all of these different cases is because they're all so unique, right? So Lori is doing work in South Africa. The paper that I mentioned before, Lori has worked in that area as well. So Mexico-US migration. We have seen climate-driven migration within the United States or to the United States after Hurricane Mitch, right? So it's not a matter of sort of these select spots. I just got back from what's called the Laurier Migration Workshop in Ontario, and one of the things that we talked about is that environmental EMD, environmental migration and displacement, has been going on for a long time. We're just now starting to recognize it, right? So it's not a matter of finding the spots. It's really about sort of bringing this into our focus.
For you, Jack, and probably you too, Beth, with COP, what did you notice as, missing? You made some enticing remark that there was a bunch of stuff in that way, and especially what's, key, critical, pivotal, that just doesn't, we just don't want to look at.
So I actually had a slide in here earlier and had to cut it for time, but so places are connected to one another by migration, right, in very unique ways. Mexico and the United States have a very unique migration relationship. There are a number of different systems that are operating within Europe, within Asia, for instance. One of the things that bothered me very much about the IOM panel that I mentioned was the fact that these origin-destination linkages, these sending and receiving area linkages, were not emphasized at all. So there were panelists, there were probably about 15 panelists. They did sort of a back-to-back thing. And the only person that brought up, sort of where do people go? What do the livelihoods look like after people are displaced was Michelle Layton, right? There was one person who talked about it. Incidentally, she's written a really great book chapter on slow onset disasters and migration, nonetheless. That was very disappointing. It was also disappointing that the IOM was really one of the only kind of formalized migration panels. I thought it would have been much more chock full, and it really wasn't.
Well, I might have a more hopeful answer because I spent a lot of time at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, which would look as seemingly liberal progressive here around its climate stance, even though it's kind of a chamber of commerce for developed countries in some ways. And they had great panels with tons of information, and I just kept going back. And one of the things I learned there is that they see this road through Paris, the kind of work we're doing now. Paris is not a final destination, you all know that, is creating, they call them country clubs. That doesn't translate that well, but it's groups of countries working together. Yeah, no, that is what they're saying in English. I don't think they understand how that resonates. But countries coming together to do this public financing and technology transfer, not as all 196 countries in the world, but in groupings that make sense historically because of connections with language, because of existing relationships. I mean, really recognizing that those relationships will matter in the way that the financing and work going forward, the transparency will actually work. So they might have something interesting to say to the migration.
That's a tricky question, though, especially on the migration side. So at this Laurier workshop, we were talking with the U.S. Consul General in Toronto about creating a network for Canadian and U.S. scholars to start talking about environmentally driven migration. You can read the report, like I mentioned. One of the things we ran into, though, is that when we think about immigration and integration policy in specific settings, right, it almost makes these dialogues like you can't have them. So in the United States, in the U.S. case, we're dealing with, positive and negative selection, like I talked about before. Canada has a very, very different set of policies. It's all designed towards very highly skilled immigrants, right? And so if we're going to have some sort of discussion about what we're going to be doing in developing sort of a joint planning policy sort of strategizing workshop around this, it's virtually impossible to have that discussion. So it was a very frustrating part as well. So not to say that people can't be friends.
And that's our closest ally.
Yeah. Yes. That's right.
So I have a comment and followed up by a question. So Todd mentioned about the countries which may be most vulnerable to climate migration, and perhaps coming from where I come from, I would say that it's really Bangladesh. 40% of the population is very susceptible to rising seas. Okay, and we are not talking, a few millions here. We're talking tens of millions, probably 40 million, 50 million, and upwards. Okay, that's a very serious situation. Okay, and so the question I have has to do with climate change migration. This is a very tricky question, so please don't answer it. I don't expect an answer. But climate change, migration, population growth, and extremism and religion, I think they're all tied together. If you look at the map of the world where you see the highest population growth, it has something to do with religion, right? And that's where I think the climate change is happening. Okay, so a lot of people would say the wars in the Middle East are not being fought on religion, but it's being fought on lack of water resources. But they're all tied together, I think. So that could be a fantastic research topic, I think, for you folks.
I mean, the United Nations just came out with a new set of population projections, right? And so one of the things you realize is that what is driving population growth? It's very little to do with the mortality piece, right? Because we've made gains in mortality, started out with child mortality, and then old age mortality. So it's really the fertility piece. And then the next question is what you mentioned, certain areas of the world. So fertility is coming down, and it has been for a while, but we run into this problem of fertility stalls, what demographers call it. And so Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, is one area where fertility has stalled. So consequently, we're going to see very large population growth in Africa. The population of Europe is going to begin declining because of fertility rates, and there's been some interesting projections looking at what you described, projecting out religious affiliation, right, within Europe in light of the fact that not as many babies are going to be born in the future. So there is no easy answer, but this is one of the reasons that it's very near and dear to me to start talking about issues of anti-immigrant sentiment or religious affiliation, right? Fertility, all of those things are tied together. I completely agree.
There's some interesting papers. I can't cite them off the top of my head, but if you look, just showing how many more people are affected by climate change urgently right now, the adaptation need now, than by terrorism, extremism. Just statistically, number of people affected, and that really looking at ISIS and getting worked up about extremism is just a diversion from the biggest real issue. And then I would just, maybe you'll think it's kind of kumbaya, but I would say, the work of Pope Francis and the papal encyclical on climate change. There's also been work from Muslim leaders. We had a panel here on climate change and faith and heard from some Muslim students here at the university about that. And we have so much more in common based on looking at our fundamental values based on faith and how we might steward the planet and care for one another than we have that separates us. And I think we have a role in the university to remind our students of that. There's a conference that really highlights that happens at Seattle University. It's called Just Sustainability. And they actually have worked with a network of Jesuit institutions. It's a Christian tradition, but really looking at this, the ethics underlying this question. And I think they are thoughtful about the ethics that are in common across religious traditions.
Beth's much more of an optimist than I am. But I had the opportunity at COP21. I was eating lunch and I noticed that the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, was talking, and I ran over and I thought this is great because I've read some of his books, and I was one of 3 or 4 people in the audience, and I was another sad disappointment there. But it could have been there was a competing session.
I didn't know about that one. Yeah, I would have been at that. At COP. There were some of you were there. There were so many things going on and so many things to choose from, and it was taking place at Le Bourget, which is this former airport, and it was on the tarmac, and you'd have to navigate from one building to another. They look the same.
Yeah, they do.
So,
The Just a question for both of you. It's perhaps a bit of an esoteric question, but I mean it to have deeper meaning than on the surface. And that it's kind of a vocabulary question, right? We talk about, and Jack, you and I have talked about this, Beth, we've talked about it too, the idea of adaptation versus this concept that we hear much more commonly in the discourse about resiliency. And I have asked both of you, does resiliency include or allow for these kinds of issues? Or is resiliency a hope that everything can just stay the way it already was? What do you think about adaptation and resiliency as it speaks to migration?
Well, I've learned a lot from Jessica, and I think I've turned from liking resilience to liking adaptation because I think it's more specific.
Yeah, this is something where I'm going to have to sort of pause and say I don't know right now. And part of it is that the group of folks that I work in are still wrestling with the concept of adaptation. In fact, we're still wrestling with labels like environmental migration and displacement. And the reason we're wrestling with those labels is because they actually matter quite a bit. So if you look at like backlog counts for legal permanent residents, there's distinctions between, if you're classified as a refugee, for instance. So if we classify environmental migrants as economic migrants, guess what? They're on the waiting list, and the waiting list is way long. But if we don't, then they can come right in, right? And so we're wrestling with all these designations. We actually talked about putting together a concept paper to sort of clarify these terms. I'm not on the resilience side yet, but it's not to say I won't be in the future.
But to be a refugee currently means you have to say you're a refugee for basically a political or persecution reason, and not a. So we don't really know, right? People are saying that because they need to be refugees, but that might not be their first reason.
Correct. And it very much matters to, if they're able to get in on an LPR status. That's right. To the U.S.
This builds a little bit on the adaptation and the resilience question, and I'm thinking about Europe right now and migration, and you could argue these are people leaving conflicts, but underneath those conflicts are significant environmental changes, and we're starting to see challenge of very kind of foundational European institutional practices and structures, and at some point things break. So there's an article today in the New York Times about Europe talking about getting rid of the Schengen Agreement, which would be a really significant change for a huge part of the world, both in terms of migrants moving around and in terms of people who live there and goods and economic trade issues. And so in terms of thinking about these justice issues, how much of the conversation has moved toward what if some of these really fundamental institutional structures in states and in nation states and regions and big chunks of the world start to not work anymore? Because there's huge, not just economic and social issues, but justice issues coming out of that.
So I sometimes think in examples. So here's an example that I would say in the European case. So imagine that you're living in Western Poland, and this would be sort of around the time of transition to a market economy. You cannot make it in your rural area, your rural village. So you migrate to Germany and you work as an au pair, right? You do this for a series of years and you go back and forth, and eventually you hand the position off to your niece or your daughter and so on. There are specific systems within Europe, and one of the systems is from Poland to Germany or Poland to the UK, and one of the main goals is to make it to a place like Norway or Sweden, right? And eventually to move back to Poland. This ties directly into Beth's point earlier on. When these institutions like Schengen collapse, right, it makes it very difficult to then tag on something like, well, what's the livelihood situation going to look like after people are displaced? So I worry about that a lot. There's other agreements as well. There's the inter-Nordic migration agreement between the 4 Nordic countries. One of the side benefits is that they have just bloody good data on migration because they're agreeing to track it. But another benefit is the fact that people can move around, right, and they can respond to labor market changes. We lose the ability to do that, exactly.
We have a couple online questions, so I'm going to jump over to those here real quickly. First question comes from Cindy Christensen, and the question is, how much international support exists for creating means of livelihoods in refugee camps? So maybe, Jack, I'll pitch that one to you. And then Beth, if you want to take the second question here, comes from Muhammad Jiwa, who asks, we can address this by, and I'm thinking this is the topic of the day, by working in Minnesota to make sure the Clean Power Plan builds an equitable economic system. Who will be building renewables? Who will have access to renewable technology?
Okay, so the first question, I'm not a policy expert, so this is an area that I sort of step into lightly. But based on the recommendations, based on the report that came out from the Laurier Migration Workshop that I attended, my sense is that there's a lot of support for thinking about these transitions to livelihoods. The concern is that there's not a lot of systems in place, and people don't exactly know what to do. So one of my colleagues, Beth Ferris, is working on this. In fact, I think she just relocated to New York to take this on as a task with the United Nations. So I think right now, there is a lot of support. There's just not a lot of direction.
Well, back on the Minnesota story, that's a good chance to highlight an intersection of responding to climate change and putting equity at the center. So Muhammad actually is connected to Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, and they've worked with some other nonprofits in the Twin Cities to have an equity lens for doing community solar. So you can check it out if you Google it or look at the MNIPL website. And that's really bringing home the ideas we've just been talking about into looking at community solar gardens. The pushback might be, oh, well, if you do that, it's going to take too long. And you know, I've been a city council member and had to make a city work year to year, and I understand wanting to get projects done. But I would also say that sort of once you set a pathway and a set of customs and practices and expectations, people tend to follow that. So if we're just launching and developing community solar gardens, it's really now is the right time to attend to what the values embedded in those programs are. So great question.
We have time for a couple more questions. So I'm going to go back here first.
Beth, as researchers, I think there's not always adequate emphasis for justice in the work that we do. I wonder if you have ideas for ways we can hold ourselves accountable or ways to maybe change some of the professional incentives in our work.
Well, I got a preview of that question in the coffee room earlier, which I welcome. And I think some of you in the room have participated in the equity and diversity workshops that are going on here on campus. And there's also an initiative called Campus Climate. If you haven't checked that out, you really should. And that's efforts that are really putting issues of equity, inclusivity, right front and center. There's also a group here on campus called Who's Diversity. It's a non-official student group, but they've come up with 10 basically demands for the university to respond to, which are really worth reading and taking a look at and thinking about your own practice and your own office and how you might respond. So, or show up at some of those events and start to meet people and ask questions. You know, I'm really myself kind of still in progress in doing that. I think it takes time to build relationships, but you know, the opportunities are all around us.
So Who's Diversity is a great example. Another thing that I think we can do to hold ourselves accountable, and this is given sort of constraints where we operate in terms of our positions within the workplace, but reaching out and getting involved in the community as well. So I've done talks at the Minneapolis Institute of Art talking about demography and diversity and exclusion as part of their strategic planning process. So to the extent that I'm able to sort of get involved with those groups, I really welcome those opportunities. So that's one example.
So I just want to go back to the livelihood question and wondering to what extent education is part of that, because there's so many children and young people that are part of this migration, that it's not just parents finding employment and whatnot, but maintaining education for kids as they go through this whole process. And is that part of the conversation?
It is, and this is one of the smaller parts of the conversation. So I have a graduate student right now who is taking everything I showed you in terms of migration movements and breaking this down by education, looking at students, looking at recruitment efforts in the US side. What's very interesting, though, is to go back to sort of tie this into one of the other commenters who's not here anymore, but these notions of anti-immigrant sentiment, but anti-immigrant legislation as well, right? So these two things intersect. So if we have educational consortiums, which we do in places like Indiana and Alabama, in some of the same places, Arizona, some of the same places that have some of the most restrictive immigrant legislation on the books, right? And so we run into this problem of sort of contradictions in the messages that we're sending as well. I do think that education is a part of the story, but it's not a very developed one right now, but I can give you names and stuff of folks who are actively working on this.
I want to say thank you to our speakers today for a fascinating discussion. Let's give them a big hand. And we actually have a session coming up next week that I think dovetails nicely with today's talk. The big question next week is how can infrastructure support sustainable urban living? So please join us next Wednesday at noon. Thanks, everyone.